The wind howled across the cracked earth like a living thing, dragging dust and despair through the dying town of Red Hollow, and Clara Whitmore pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stood outside the saloon with her child pressed against her chest, the boy's small fingers clutching her dress as if it were the last solid thing in the world, and in many ways it was, because Clara had nothing left, no home, no money, no family, and no future anyone could see, only a 5-year-old son named Eli whose ribs showed through his shirt and whose eyes were too old for his age, eyes that had seen too many doors slammed shut and too many nights spent counting stars instead of sleeping under a roof, and as Clara stared at the swinging saloon doors she felt the weight of shame pressing on her lungs because she knew what people thought when they saw a woman like her in the Wild West, a woman alone with a child and no ring on her finger, no man at her side, no place she belonged. Just another broken soul drifting west until the land itself rejected her, and Red Hollow had done just that, because she'd begged for work all day, washing dishes, cleaning stables, sewing, anything, but hunger had made her hands shake and no one wanted weakness around their livelihood, especially not weakness that came with a child, and now night was falling, the cold creeping in fast, and she knew if she didn't find shelter Eli wouldn't make it through another night, not with the cough rattling in his chest and his fevered skin burning against hers, and when the saloon doors burst open with laughter and the smell of whiskey, she heard a voice inside her head whisper that she might have to do something she swore she never would, something that would break the last piece of dignity she still carried, and she closed her eyes for a moment and prayed, not for herself, but for her son, when suddenly the laughter inside the saloon fell quiet and the heavy doors creaked open again, and out stepped a man who looked like the land itself had carved him, tall and broad-shouldered, dust on his boots and steel in his eyes, a rancher by the look of him, one hand resting near his belt, not in threat but habit, and his gaze swept the street once before settling on Clara, and she felt it like a hand closing around her spine, because men didn't look at her anymore unless they wanted something, and she braced herself. But this man didn't leer or smirk, didn't step too close, he just studied her like he was weighing a problem no one else had noticed, and then he spoke, his voice low and rough from years of wind and solitude, "You got somewhere to sleep tonight," and Clara swallowed, her pride screaming at her to lie, but Eli coughed violently against her chest and the truth spilled out before she could stop it, "No, sir," and the man's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking to the boy, then back to her face, and something unreadable passed through them before he nodded once and said words she never expected to hear, words that would change the course of her life forever, "I need a wife tonight," and for a heartbeat the world stopped, the wind stilled, the noise of the saloon faded, and Clara stared at him, certain she'd misheard, but he continued before she could speak, "Not for what you're thinking," he added, almost sharply, "I've got a ranch east of here, a judge riding through at dawn, and a problem that needs fixing by morning," and she felt fear coil in her stomach because nothing good ever came with urgency, especially not when it involved a woman like her, and she pulled Eli closer and whispered, "I'm not that kind of woman," and the rancher's mouth twitched, not a smile, but something close to pain, and he said quietly, "Neither am I that kind of man," and he told her his name was Jacob Hale, that his land was under threat because of a false claim by a neighboring baron who wanted to swallow smaller ranches whole, that the law favored married men when it came to homestead disputes, and that a widow or a single woman wouldn't be safe on the plains alone, not with wolves in human skin roaming free, and Clara listened with disbelief because men didn't offer protection without cost, but Jacob didn't touch her, didn't demand anything, only said, "You'll have food, a roof, and a bed for your boy, tonight and tomorrow and as long as you need," and something in his voice cracked on the last words, like a man who'd lost something once and never stopped paying for it, and Clara felt tears sting her eyes because the choice wasn't really a choice at all, pride or survival, and when Eli looked up at her with pleading eyes and whispered, "Mama, I'm cold," her decision was made, and she nodded once, barely, and Jacob turned immediately, as if afraid she'd change her mind, and helped her onto his horse, lifting Eli gently as though the boy were made of glass. And as they rode out of Red Hollow under a sky bruised purple and gold, Clara felt terror and hope twist together in her chest, because she didn't know if she was riding toward salvation or another kind of ruin, but for the first time in months Eli slept against her shoulder without shivering, and the ranch appeared out of the darkness like a promise carved from wood and earth, the house solid, lights glowing warm against the cold, and Jacob helped them inside where a fire crackled and food waited on the table as if he'd known all along they were coming, and Clara almost broke then, almost sank to the floor from the weight of kindness she hadn't earned, and as Eli ate until color returned to his cheeks, Jacob explained the arrangement plainly, that the marriage would be legal but respectful, that she'd have her own room, that no one would touch her without her consent, and Clara listened with guarded disbelief because men didn't make promises like that and keep them, but something about Jacob's eyes told her he meant every word. And as night settled over the ranch and the wind rattled the windows, Clara lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to her son breathe steadily for the first time in weeks, and wondered what kind of man would stake his reputation on a stranger and her child, and what kind of future could grow from a lie told for survival, unaware that by morning the lie would begin to feel dangerously close to the truth, and that both of them were standing at the edge of a story far bigger than either had planned. A story of pain, redemption, and a love forged not by choice at first, but by courage when it mattered most. And if you want to see how that story unfolds, how a homeless mother and a hardened rancher faced the judgment of a cruel world together, morning came to the Hale Ranch with a pale sun crawling over the hills like it was unsure whether the world deserved its light, and Clara woke before the rooster, her body stiff from a night of half-sleep and racing thoughts, listening to the unfamiliar quiet that came not from loneliness but from safety, a kind of quiet she hadn't known in years, and for a moment she forgot where she was until the weight of yesterday rushed back. The saloon, the words "I need a wife tonight," the horse ride through darkness, and the lie she had agreed to live inside, and she sat up fast, heart pounding, only to hear Eli's soft breathing beside her on the narrow bed, his face relaxed, color in his cheeks, and tears welled in her eyes because no matter what today brought, that alone felt like a miracle, and she brushed his hair back gently, whispering a promise she wasn't sure she could keep, when a knock came at the door, firm but respectful, and Jacob's voice followed, "Breakfast's ready," and there was no hesitation, no awkwardness, just calm steadiness, and that unsettled her more than cruelty ever had, because cruelty she knew how to survive, but kindness required trust, and trust was dangerous. And when she stepped into the kitchen she saw Jacob already dressed for the day, hat on the table, sleeves rolled, a man preparing for battle disguised as routine, and he nodded once and poured her coffee as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if she had always belonged there, and Eli ate with an appetite that made Jacob's mouth soften at the corners, and then the sound of hooves echoed in the distance, and Clara felt her stomach drop because she knew without being told, the judge had arrived, and Jacob stood, straightening his coat, and said quietly, "Whatever happens, follow my lead." And she nodded even though fear crawled up her spine, because she had followed men before and it had never ended well, and moments later the judge rode in with 2 deputies and the neighboring baron, Victor Crow, a man with a smile too polished and eyes too empty, the kind of man who took land and lives with equal ease, and Crow's gaze slid to Clara and lingered just long enough to make her skin crawl, and Jacob's hand tightened slightly at her back, not possessive but protective, and he introduced her clearly, confidently, "My wife, Clara Hale," and the judge raised an eyebrow, surprised, but nodded, and the legal words followed like gunshots, claims, deeds, witnesses, and Clara answered when spoken to, her voice steady despite the way her hands trembled, and Eli stood at her side, small but proud, and Crow laughed at one point, mocking, suggesting the marriage was convenient, rushed, suspicious, and the judge looked to Clara then, really looked, and asked softly, "Is this man your husband?" And in that moment Clara realized the lie had teeth, because if she faltered even a little, everything would collapse, and she thought of cold streets and empty nights and Eli's cough, and she lifted her chin and said, "Yes, sir," with a conviction that surprised even her, and the judge studied her a long moment before nodding, and the ruling came down firm. The land was Jacob's, the claim dismissed, and Crow's smile vanished, replaced by something darker, something that promised. This wasn't over. And when they rode away the tension didn't leave with them, it only shifted, settling heavy in the air, and Jacob exhaled slowly and said, "Thank you," not like a man thanking a tool, but like one acknowledging a sacrifice, and Clara nodded, unsure what she had just stepped into, because Crow was not a man who accepted loss quietly, and the days that followed proved it, because fences were cut, cattle scattered, shots fired in the night, and Clara learned quickly that ranch Life was not gentle, that survival required grit and silence and courage, and she worked beside Jacob without complaint, cooking, cleaning, mending, learning the land as if it were another child to protect, and townsfolk whispered when they rode in together, some with suspicion, some with judgment, others with envy, but Clara held her head high because she had already lived through worse than gossip, and Jacob never corrected them when they called her Mrs. Hale, never pulled away from her in public, never crossed a line in private, and that restraint built something fragile and powerful between them, something like respect, and Eli flourished under Jacob's quiet guidance, learning to ride, to tend animals, to laugh again, and one evening as they watched the sunset bleed red across the plains, Eli said something that cracked the ground beneath them both, "I wish you were really my papa," and Clara froze, fear and longing colliding in her chest. But Jacob only stared at the horizon, jaw tight, and said hoarsely, "I'd be proud if I were," and that night Clara learned the truth she hadn't known, that Jacob had lost a wife and infant years ago to sickness, that the ranch was his refuge and his punishment, that he had built walls high enough to survive but too high to live, and something in her softened then, because broken recognized broken, and the danger came swift and violent, because Crow returned with hired men, guns blazing, intent on taking what the law had denied him, and the ranch erupted into chaos, shots echoing, cattle stampeding, Eli hiding under the floorboards while Clara loaded a rifle with shaking hands, and Jacob fought like a man with everything to lose, and when Crow cornered Clara in the barn, sneering, saying she was just another drifter who didn't belong, she raised the rifle and stood her ground, not for pride, not for Jacob, but for her child, and the sound of the shot rang out like a declaration, and Crow fell, wounded but alive, retreating with his men as the deputies arrived too late to stop the violence but in time to end it, and when the dust settled and blood was cleaned and silence returned, Jacob found Clara shaking beside the barn, and without words he wrapped his arms around her, and this time she didn't pull away, because fear had stripped pretense bare, and the days that followed were quieter, heavier, filled with healing, and one night Jacob stood before her, eyes raw, and said, "You don't have to stay. The danger's past. I won't trap you in a lie," and Clara looked around the home that no longer felt borrowed, at the man who had never demanded her body but had offered his soul in pieces, at the child who slept peacefully under a roof that didn't leak hope away, and she realized the truth had changed while she wasn't looking, because what began as survival had become choice, and she said softly, "I don't want to leave," and Jacob swallowed hard and said, "Then stay. Not as a favor. As my wife. For real," and the kiss they shared was gentle, earned, a promise rather than a claim, and months later when the town gathered for a proper wedding, Clara walked down the aisle not as a homeless woman saved by a rancher, but as a woman who had fought for her place in the world, and Eli ran ahead laughing, calling Jacob Papa without fear this time, and as the sun set over the land that had tried to break them both, Clara understood that home was not walls or papers or names, but the people who chose you when the world turns cold, and if this story moved you, if it reminded you that even in the harshest times hope can still rise, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because more powerful Wild West stories of love, survival, and second chances are coming, and the next one might change you just as much.